This reflection is based on a story in Mark 10, 46 to 52. The story is of a blind man. He's sitting by the side of the road and he hears a crowd and a bit of a commotion and asks what's going on. And the people say to him, "It's Jesus of Nazareth, he's passing by." And so the man called out, "Son of Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the people with Jesus tried to shush him and tell him to be quiet. That just made him call out all the more. So Jesus stopped and said, "Bring the man to me." And so they did. And as soon as they said to him, "Look, Jesus wants you," then it says he jumped to his feet, he threw off his cloak and he went to Jesus. And then Jesus said to him, "Now what can I do for you?" And the man simply said, "Rabbi, I want to see." Jesus said, "Go, your faith has healed you." And we read immediately he could see quite clearly and he followed Jesus along the road. So that's the story. Now we can view this story as just another story of a healing done by Jesus, but this story has a lot more to tell us. When Mark wrote his gospel, he didn't just think of stories randomly and put them down. They have a meaning and their placement is important. So firstly, we learn that Jesus was leaving the town of Jericho and he was heading toward Jerusalem. Now he's already told his disciples 3 times that he is going to face arrest, death, and so he's on his way there. He's facing up to what's going to happen. The blind man was sitting beside the road. He was outside the city of Jericho. Being blind meant you had to beg for a living. You couldn't work, you couldn't support a family, you just had to rely on the generosity of others. So symbolically he was right at the bottom of society, really. He just didn't belong. But this blind beggar isn't just someone who's heard of Jesus healing people and thinking, "Wow, here's my chance, I'll see if he can heal me." He calls out, "Jesus, Son of David." Now that is a recognition of who Jesus really is. It's a kingly title that he's giving him. He's seen past Jesus as the miracle worker who might heal him. And then he calls out, "Have mercy on me." There's no demand, there's no presumption, there's no thinking that I have my rights. It simply was, have mercy on me. When Jesus told the people to bring him to him, he jumped up and threw off his cloak. Now that sounds like he was really happy, and I guess he probably was. But throwing his cloak aside was quite significant. This would have been his only possession. It would be what he slept under at night. It's probably what he laid out on the ground for people to put coins on. And he probably used it in winter to keep himself warm. It was his lone possession, but he threw it aside to run to Jesus. Now, this is a contrast to an earlier story we read where a very rich young man came to Jesus and said, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus very lovingly took him aside and said, "Look, you've got to give up your wealth. It's what's standing in the way." And he couldn't do it. He said he walked away sad because he just couldn't give it up. His wealth meant too much to him. And yet this beggar, who had practically nothing, was willing to toss aside all that he possessed to go to Jesus. Then we have the question that Jesus asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" And his reply, "Rabbi, I want to see." And again, there's a contrast with last week's story where James and John went up to Jesus and Jesus said, "Well, what can I do for you?" And they said, "We want the seats of honour in your kingdom." James and John were asking for honour. The blind man was simply asking for mercy. He was instantly healed, and it says he followed Jesus along the road. And remember that Jesus was heading for Jerusalem, heading for his death, and this man was willing to follow along that path. Now back in chapter 8, we had a story of people bringing a blind man to Jesus, to him to heal. And it says Jesus put his hands on his eyes and then he said, "What do you see?" And the man said, "Oh, I can see people walking, but they look more like trees." So Jesus had to pray again and put hands on him again. And this time his sight came clear. And then that story is followed by Peter. Peter saying, "You are the Messiah." He's come to that recognition. And then after that spiritual insight, straight away, he's saying to Jesus, "Oh, I'm not going to let that happen to you," when Jesus starts to talk about his death. So he goes from spiritual insight to spiritual blindness very quickly. So these stories are there before Jesus has really told his disciples what it means that he's going to Jerusalem, that he will die. Because true understanding of who Jesus is, why he came to earth, can only be fully understood in the light of the crucifixion and the resurrection. This blind man received instant sight. Spiritually, he knew who Jesus was and what it meant, and he was willing to follow him on the way of sacrifice. He's an example of how we should be, knowing we're totally reliant on the mercy of God and willing to give up whatever we think is important and follow Jesus along the road of sacrifice.